Everyone. I was just grading your learning paragraphs for the week and it was fun. I thought it was great. It was interesting to hear how everybody's process and what they're going through. A couple people did audio recordings, which is always fun for me to listen to. But a lot of people, and I see this frequently at this point in the quarter, a lot of people are trying to figure out their study strategy. What's the best way to learn this information? What's the best way to do things? So I wrote this out, and as I was grading about halfway through, I wrote it out for a few people, and I thought, hey, I'm going to share this with everyone. So I have a sequence that I recommend for learning the material, and it might not be the sequence that you traditionally use. Some people, if you think of a traditional non-hybrid class where you're going into class every day, usually you go in and you listen to the lecture, and then maybe you go home and you read through the textbook. Some people take notes while they're in the lecture and while they're reading through the textbook. And then maybe you make some flashcards, and then maybe you'll look at the learning objectives. So I'm going to suggest a sort of a different sequence. So there's a great book that you probably don't have time to read right now. In the future, you can read it over the break between spring and summer. It was written by a brain scientist at the University of Washington. It's called Brain Rules, and it talks about how our brains learn information and process information. And it's an engaging read. It's not technical, but it gives you some ideas. And one of the concepts or one of the rules that he came up with was that we need a framework to store information in. So if I just give you a bunch of random information, it's going to be a lot harder for you to remember than if you have a framework to file all that information in. So the learning objectives, I intend for them to be the framework that you are going to file the information in. So in the sequence that I recommend for learning the information, you don't hear the lecture first and you don't read the book second. What I recommend you do is read through the learning objectives first, and then take the textbook and try to dig out, don't read the textbook yet, try to dig out that information. So let's take a look at the chapter 2 and 3 learning objectives from this week, and we'll kind of see how this process might work. So here are chapter 2 and 3 learning objectives from Canvas. So chapter 2, having not listened to the lecture, presumably, or anything, I look at number 1 and I say differentiate axial skeleton and appendicular skeleton. And so I'm like, okay, I can do that. I had that in A and P, I remember that. And I'm going to write down what I think my answer is. And then I'm going to move on to the next one. Describe the 2 different types of bone tissue. And I go, oh, I don't remember that from A and P. So I'm going to get my book. I'm going to look at chapter 2, and I'm going to look for the 2 different types of bone tissue. And I'm going to write that down. So right now, I'm just kind of gathering information. I'm not quite studying it yet. And then 3 primary classifications of joints and providing examples of each. And if I remember that from my A&P class, I'm like, great, I'm going to write those down, put my examples in. If not, I'm going to look it up in the book and find those. So same thing as we go through all of those. Common components of a synovial joint, 5 different bone types, and come up with examples. So at this point, I'm not even trying to remember and understand the information. I'm just gathering information. And chapter 3, define active and passive insufficiency. So did I say give examples of them? I didn't. So just define active and passive insufficiency. When we go forward into future chapters, we're going to start giving examples in the around the different joints. But at this point, we're just looking at the definition. So if you're thinking about the test and you're like, oh, I have to know active and passive insufficiency back and forth, you don't at this point. You just have to know the definition of them and kind of what they are. And then some other definitions that were in there: concentric, eccentric, isometric, identifying agonist and antagonist muscle groups, and the types of muscle contractions and levers involved in a given movement example. So if I said in elbow flexion, what is the agonist group and what's the antagonist group. And so usually when we're talking about muscle groups, I want to think about functional groups, not necessarily like, oh, biceps for the agonist and triceps for the antagonist, but even more functional elbow flexors as the agonist, because there are more of them than just the biceps, and elbow extensors for the antagonist muscle. So kind of bringing it down to kind of a simpler level. And when you flex the elbow flexors are the agonist muscle performing a concentric muscle contraction. And when you extend the elbow, a lot of times, depending on the relationship of gravity, the flexor muscles are doing an eccentric muscle contraction to lower that muscle down. And it's a third class lever. We're not going to get too much into that. We'll get more into that later. But and then the different muscle shapes and giving examples of individual ones. So I hope the muscle shapes are pretty straightforward. So at this point, and in my example of study strategy, this is Monday. I'm going to go through the learning objectives. I'm going to look some stuff up in the book. And then on Tuesday, I'm going to listen to the recorded lectures. And now having kind of done this, and I'm not at this point, I haven't really tried to commit to memory or learn every single thing on the learning objectives. I'm just gathering information. So now when I listen to the recorded lectures, I kind of know what I'm looking for. I'm like, this wasn't super clear to me, so I'm going to pay really good attention in this section of the lecture and see if I can fill in those learning objectives a little bit better. So that's just Tuesday. Is now we have the framework with the learning objectives, and now I'm going to listen to the lectures. Okay, on Wednesday, I'm going to delve a little bit deeper. I listened to the lectures, I have my learning objectives framework, and now I'm going to actually read the chapter, and I'm going to fill in any gaps that I had in my learning objectives. And while I'm doing that, some people, while they're reading, they take notes. That's a great thing to do. Or while they're listening to the lectures, they take notes. Some people will print out the learning objectives, and while they're listening to the lectures, they will make notes with regard to the learning objectives. That's a good thing to do. So now on Wednesday, I am reading the chapter and I'm filling in any gaps in the learning objectives that I hadn't already filled in from before. So we're kind of learning in a graded manner. We're not trying to learn it all in the first time we go through it. At this point, maybe you're making flashcards or you're writing down terminology that you can't remember. I remember when I was studying for the board exam, for the PTA board exam, I kept on forgetting the definition of the word apraxia. And I had to keep looking it up, apraxia. So make a flashcard for apraxia. So you're making flashcards. And then on Thursday, take a break from studying. Allow your neurons time to encode this information. Do something else. Study for a different class. Maybe do a different activity, like think about it while you're working out, or color muscles in a anatomy coloring book, or the trail guide from the body, or your lab manual. So just kind of take a break from the listening to lectures, reading the book, going through flashcards. Take a little bit of a break. Let that information encode. Okay, then on Friday, you are going to review your flashcards, revisit the learning objectives, incorporate activities that are going to reinforce your brain map of the information, like flashcards, coloring, movement study, so doing the movements and figuring things out, verbally reviewing the information with your study group. So that can be, in the next few days you do that. And then when the new chapter comes up the next week, you start over the same way. So you're not beating a learning objective into your brain until you think you understand it. That's not the best way to encode those memories into long-term memory. We're kind of doing it in a graded manner. So if you're up for it, you can try that method and see how it works. What I recommend for study groups is, and I used to do this with my study group when I was in the PTA program. We would get together every Saturday morning because that's what worked for us. And we would go through all the learning objectives. So we would start not just on chapter 2 and 3 for this week, we would start on chapter 1 and go through every one of them verbally until we got to one that we said, I don't know, we better ask the teacher about that one in the next class. So we made a point of asking about that one. So every time we got together, we reinforced the learning objectives. So the power of a study group, it's really powerful. The other types of things you can do with your study group is you can take turns explaining things to each other. You can, in lab, we're going to be palpating. If you're doing a study group is meeting in a virtual sense, like on Zoom, you can't really palpate, but you can practice palpating either a family member that's with you or yourself and find bony landmarks, find palpation examples on yourself. You can practice muscles, you can review information verbally. So that is really a good skill to have. It's something you're going to be tested on in the practical exams. And it's a good way to reinforce the information. So you're using different senses to reinforce the information that you're learning. So try it. Try it my way and see if it works for you. And when I say my way, I mean this is based on research that I've studied for effective ways of learning information and conceptualizing it into a body of knowledge that you are then going to be able to apply. So that is really what we want to do here. We don't just want to memorize a bunch of information because that is not going to do us any good. We need to go beyond memorization. Obviously, there is some memorization, but we need to get beyond that and be able to use those memories into concepts that are going to help us apply the information in the clinic and be good clinical decision makers. So hopefully this is helpful. If you have questions about this, ask me because I want to help you learn this information and learn it better.